places you think are safe until something moves where it shouldn't. A knock in a house with no basement. A car on a Montana roadside, door ajar, hiding a bullet hole no one explains. An old inn that breathes in the dark and grabs at your ankles. These aren't accidents. They're invitations. And once you hear them, you can't ignore what's waiting. The hidden basement. Nathan had just graduated high school and was getting ready to head off to college in the fall. His parents had recently made a big change in their lives. After years of talking about it, they finally decided to downsize and bought an older home a few towns over. It was a good move for them, especially with Nathan heading off to school, but it meant he hadn't spent much time there. He'd only been in the new house a handful of times since they bought it. The first time, his parents gave him a quick tour, pointing out where everything was and explaining the quirks of an older home. One thing they specifically mentioned was that the house didn't have a basement, just a crawl space for utilities. They seemed pretty definitive about it, so Nathan never gave it a second thought. A few months later, Nathan's parents went on a week-long vacation, leaving him in charge of the place. He was excited to have the house to himself for a few days, but that feeling quickly faded. The first night he noticed anything strange was a Tuesday. It was late, and he was lying in bed trying to fall asleep when he heard a faint tapping sound coming from directly below the floor. It was consistent, both in rhythm and volume. He figured it was probably just the heating system kicking on or maybe some old pipe settling, but it didn't stop. His room was on the first floor, so the sounds were definitely coming from underground. He got up and walked around trying to pinpoint the source, but the sound seemed to be everywhere beneath the floor. What made it so unsettling was the fact that, according to his parents, there was nothing but a dirt floor crawl space down there. The idea that he was hearing something so deliberate from below ground was genuinely unnerving. Eventually, the tapping stopped, and Nathan was finally able to fall asleep. When he woke up the next morning, he tried to convince himself that he had just been hearing an animal or some old house sounds. But that night, at around the same time, the tapping started again. This time, it was noticeably louder. It was almost a little aggressive. He was a lot more uncomfortable, but he chalked it up to the house settling and just went to sleep. The third night was when things got seriously weird. The tapping started again, but this time, it was considerably louder and more aggressive. It was accompanied by dragging and scraping sounds like something heavy being dragged across the dirt floor. The logical part of his brain kept trying to rationalize it, insisting there had to be a reasonable explanation, but he couldn't think of one. The sounds were way too clear and purposeful to dismiss as just normal house noises. He started wondering if maybe his parents had been wrong about the basement or if there was some kind of hidden utility access he didn't know about. He just sat there in the dark, listening to the scraping and tapping, feeling completely exposed. The next morning, Nathan called his dad and told him everything. His dad, immediately concerned, told him to check the crawl space for animals. Nathan really didn't want to, but he knew he had to. He went outside, lifted the flimsy wooden cover, and looked inside. He peered into the dark space with a flashlight, but saw nothing. The dirt floor was undisturbed, not even a single paw print. His dad seemed satisfied with that and told him not to worry, but Nathan was still unsettled. He decided to look for another explanation. He walked the perimeter of the house, looking for anything he might have missed. He noticed a pile of old construction materials, lumber, tarps, concrete blocks stacked against the side of the house. He'd seen them before, but had never given them much thought. He started moving the materials, thinking they might be covering some kind of opening. What he found instead was much, much worse. A concealed storm door. It was partially painted over and looked like it hadn't been used in years, but it was a real, functional entrance. With a heavy feeling of dread, he opened the door and found a set of concrete steps leading down into what was unmistakably a basement. His parents had been completely wrong. Nathan didn't want to go down, but he had to. His heart was pounding and the air was cold and damp. He took a few steps down and shined his phone's flashlight around the space. In the brief time he was down there, he realized two things. Someone had clearly been living there, as there were empty food containers scattered all over the floor, and whoever it was, they were not normal. Scratched into the wood paneling were tallies and disturbing drawings, twisted, almost childlike depictions of people and animals. He bolted back up the stairs, slammed the storm door shut, and immediately called his parents. They were shocked, insisting they had no idea about the basement, let alone that someone had been living there. His dad asked him 100 times if he was sure no one was currently inside. Nathan reassured him that he was, and his dad said they would cut their vacation short and come home. Nathan's first move after hanging up was to go to the hardware store and buy a heavy-duty padlock. He secured the storm door from the outside, thinking that would solve the problem. But that night, he was woken up by the violent, aggressive sound of someone trying to get back into the basement. The banging and rattling were so loud and so violent he feared the door might break. He froze in bed, his heart hammering in his chest. When the banging finally stopped, Nathan crept to the window and peeked out just in time to see a tall, shadowy figure sprinting across the backyard and disappearing into the darkness. He couldn't make out any details, but seeing them flee made the situation terrifyingly real. The rest of the night blurred. The police searched the property and the basement, but found nothing. They promised more patrols, but little else. His parents came home the next day, insisting everything would be fine now that they were back. They told Nathan they would figure out a permanent solution together. Nathan left for college the following morning as planned, but he was extremely unsettled. It felt wrong leaving his parents there, knowing nothing about the person who had been living in their house. Nathan can't stop thinking about the scratches in the basement, especially the disturbing drawings. He can't imagine what that person was doing down there or what they wanted. He's still waiting for updates from his parents, but he's terrified something else is going to happen. The Vanishing Shack. Matthew grew up in a small town a few miles from the Montana-Idaho border, on the Montana side. Nothing much ever happened out there, and honestly, that was part of why he never left. This had happened a really long time ago, before the whole world had a cell phone and was chronically online. To be honest, Matthew's area hadn't changed much at all since then, which was part of the reason why what he was about to tell was still so fresh in his memory. It was the very end of August, one of those final days of summer when you could already feel the seasons turning. That morning, Matthew was driving his usual route to work, just a 2-lane stretch of highway that cut through farmland and low hills. Around 15 minutes out, he spotted a car pulled off on the shoulder. It was a light blue, older model sedan, and it looked like it had been there for a while. It was just sitting there on the shoulder. No hazards on, no one standing outside, just sitting there, angled slightly toward the ditch. Now, Matthew wasn't a fool, but he was the type of guy to help a person in need. It was just how he was raised. As he got closer, he slowed down a bit to get a better look. The car wasn't running and he couldn't see anyone inside. No one in the driver's seat, passenger seat, or the back. It was definitely strange, especially that early in the morning, but it wasn't exactly alarming. People broke down and walked off for help all the time out there. Matthew figured maybe someone had car trouble and headed off to the nearest farmhouse, so he kept driving. He had to get to work, and it didn't seem like an emergency. In all honesty, he kind of forgot about the whole thing by the time he got off, but as he was driving home, he saw that exact same car again, in the exact same spot. The only difference was that this time, the driver's side door was wide open. It hadn't been like that in the morning. He was sure of it. Matthew slowed down again, craning his neck a little as he passed, but there was still no sign of anyone. No one walking nearby, no tracks he could see, just that same old car, sitting there with the door hanging open like someone got out in a hurry and never came back. That time, he didn't shrug it off. He pulled over once he had signal again and called the non-emergency line. He told the operator where and what he had seen, and she thanked him before saying someone would check it out. When Matthew was driving into work the next day, the car was finally gone, so he figured that would be the end of it. About a week later, though, while he was eating breakfast, he saw something on the local news that caught his attention. Reportedly, the police were investigating a missing person case. Something about a vehicle found abandoned along a rural stretch of highway just outside town. The things they were saying lined up exactly with what Matthew had seen. He instantly connected the dots and turned up the volume on his TV. They didn't release the guy's name, but they said the car was registered to a man from out of town who never showed up to where he was supposed to. The thing was, according to the authorities, there was no sign of foul play, and there were no witnesses to the situation. Matthew had always been slightly suspicious of the media, so he wasn't sure he believed the story the news was giving. Either way, it was eerie that he had basically been wise to the situation right when it happened. Come to think of it, he might have been the first person or even the only person to have reported that car on the side of the road at all. It was definitely a weird feeling. He tried to move on with his life, but he just couldn't. The curiosity was getting the better of him. Like he said before, not much happened out there, so something as odd as this was far too peculiar for him to just ignore. The next morning, Matthew called his brother. He decided to call him Benjamin. Benjamin was a local firefighter, not in Matthew's exact town, but close enough that they usually heard about the same stuff. That's just kind of how things were around his neck of the woods. Matthew wanted to ask if Benjamin had any information from the police department, because he knew for a fact they often communicated with each other. Benjamin told him that they had gotten some memo about it from the sheriff's office, something about a vehicle found abandoned and obviously the missing person. Matthew asked if the police were planning to do anything about it. Benjamin said he didn't know for sure, but that they'd probably organize a search at some point. He didn't have many details beyond that. Matthew told him they should help out and maybe see if a few of the guys from the station would be willing to join in too. At first, Benjamin was confused as to why Matthew was so invested in the whole thing, but Matthew eventually convinced him. And by the way, he wasn't really sure why he was so adamant about it either. He guessed he just felt like he had some personal connection to it. He didn't even know how they'd coordinate with the police and organize the search, so he let Benjamin handle all of that himself. Within a couple days, and with permission of course, Benjamin pulled something together. The police were already planning on doing a search, and they appreciated the added help. It wasn't anything too grand, just a few officers, some off-duty firefighters, and Matthew. The search was centered around a shallow wooded patch and a couple of old irrigation ditches that ran just off the shoulder of the highway. It was the kind of terrain that wouldn't look like much from a passing car, but once you were on foot, it was clear how easy it'd be for someone to get turned around or slip out of sight. They split off into pairs to be as efficient as possible. Matthew, of course, paired up with his brother. About an hour into the search, one of the pairs radioed in. They spotted something through a break in the brush. Everyone converged on their location as quickly as possible. It turned out to be an old maintenance shack, and from the looks of it, one that probably hadn't been used in years. The whole thing was half sunken into the ground with overgrowth curling up the sides. From the road, you'd never even know it was there. The door was hanging slightly open, and Matthew could see that the lock had been snapped off. Inside, it was dark and musty, the way you'd expect an uninhabited space to feel. But as his eyes adjusted, Matthew started noticing signs that someone had been in there recently. There were empty water bottles and food wrappers all over the place in a way that seemed deliberate. The search team spread out to check for additional evidence, both inside and around the perimeter of the shack. One of the firefighters said he spotted something by the back wall, so the rest of them went over to check it out. There was a small, clean hole in one of the wooden boards, just above floor level. The hole had sharp, splintered edges that looked nothing like the kind of damage you'd expect from weather or rot, and looked exactly like a bullet hole. They searched thoroughly, both inside the shack and around it, looking for a shell casing, a slug, or any signs of blood. But there was nothing. Just that single, unexplained hole in the wall that didn't make sense given the complete lack of other evidence. The officers radioed in the discovery to dispatch, and Matthew could tell from their tone that this had moved beyond a simple missing person case. The lead officer gathered everyone together and said they'd take it from there. Then he specifically asked Matthew to leave, since he was the only civilian there. Matthew felt dismissed and frustrated, but he didn't have much choice except to comply, so he left. When he called Benjamin later that evening, his brother gave him vague responses about what had happened after he left. Eventually, Benjamin admitted that the firefighters had also been asked to leave shortly after Matthew departed. The police had basically cleared everyone out and taken over the scene entirely. Over the following weeks, Matthew waited for updates. Benjamin's contacts at the department claimed they didn't know any details about the case, which Matthew found strange. The local news never followed up beyond the original missing person report. It was like the whole thing had just been quietly dropped. Eventually, Matthew decided to drive back and find the shack on his own. He was certain he remembered exactly where it was, so one day he drove along the highway until he found the spot where they had begun the search. He spent hours walking the area where he was absolutely certain the shack should be. He followed the irrigation ditches to a T. Everything from the terrain to the sky looked exactly the same as it had that day. But there was nothing. No shack in sight. Matthew started questioning his own memory. He figured there was a slight chance that maybe he wasn't looking in the exact right place. But even if that were the case, the shack should have been somewhere in that immediate range. He tried a different section of the search area, then another, but still found nothing. It was so strange, stranger than he could describe. He remembered standing there in that overgrown scrubland completely alone, with the exception of the gentle breeze that whisked past him every so often. Peaceful, yeah, but strange. The only other explanation he could come up with was that maybe the county had removed the shack entirely. It wouldn't have been too difficult to excavate the thing and haul it away, but that seemed like an extreme response to what was supposed to be a routine missing person case. Those were the only two options, though. Either Matthew's memory had misled him, or the shack was no longer there. He left shortly after that. There wasn't much else he could do, really. He was left with this uncomfortable feeling that something important had happened during those final days of summer. Something he was briefly allowed to witness before being shut out completely. Every year when August ended and he felt that familiar shift in the air, Matthew thought about that abandoned car and that bullet hole in the wall of a shack that may or may not have even existed. The Abandoned Bunkhouse. It happened when Benjamin was just a kid his first time at a sleepaway camp in Pennsylvania. He was a shy kid and a bit of a homebody. He was the kind of boy who was much happier at home with his Super Nintendo than he was trying to make small talk with a bunch of strangers. The first day was a little overwhelming, but he was lucky enough to connect with a few other kids right away. He quickly became friends with a short, energetic kid Hell called Mike, who was always wearing a Yankees hat. Mike seemed fearless and was always the one pushing the boundaries. During the camp's initial tour, they noticed a lone bunk building off on its own, looking like it had been abandoned for years. The windows were boarded up and the paint was peeling. They asked the counselor what the deal was, but he just shrugged. It was his first week, and all he knew was that it hadn't been used in a long time. That fact, of course, was all the invitation Mike needed. On the very last night at camp, after everyone was getting ready for bed, Mike leaned over to Ben and whispered his plan. They had to sneak out and explore the abandoned bunk. Benjamin, wanting to seem cool to his new friend, agreed. They waited until their counselor's light was out and everyone in their bunk was sound asleep. Then, they slipped out the door and sprinted down the path toward the abandoned building. Ben's heart was pounding in his ears. This kind of rebellious mischief was way outside of his comfort zone. When they got to the building, they found that the front door was completely boarded up, which they already knew. But as they walked along the side of the building, they found a window with a broken pane. It was just big enough for them to squeeze through. They climbed inside and found themselves in total darkness. These bunks were pretty big each, one had room for at least 10 campers. Ben and Mike stood there for a second, arms outstretched, navigating the pitch-black room. They kept bumping into the old bunk beds. Benjamin heard Mike do it multiple times, and he did it himself too. The room was cold, with a damp, musty smell. After a moment, Ben stopped moving and listened for his friend. He heard a soft bouncing sound coming from the complete opposite side of the room. "Shh, stop messing around," Benjamin whispered, assuming Mike was jumping on an old mattress. But then, Mike's voice came from much closer to him. "That's not me. he whispered back. "I thought that was you." The bouncing stopped. All they could hear was their own breathing. It was terrifying, being in a pitch-black room in an old, unused building, with nothing but the silence to keep them company. Then, they heard a loud thump, as if the person who was bouncing on the bed had just jumped off. Without another thought, they both bolted for the window they had come in through. The window was tiny, and it was a struggle to get out. As Mike clambered through first, Ben waited his turn. His heart was racing, and his eyes were glued to the darkness where the sound had come from. As he scrambled up to the window and started to crawl through, he felt two hands grab onto his ankle and try to pull him back in. The grip was strong, but Benjamin was already halfway out, and he kicked his leg free, scrambling the rest of the way. They didn't stop running until they were back in their bunk, where they slammed the door shut and locked it. They seriously considered running to the head counselor's cabin and telling them what happened, but fear of getting in trouble outweighed their fear of what was in the bunkhouse. They got through the rest of the night without incident, and the next day, they went home, living to tell the story. Looking back now, Benjamin says the scariest part wasn't the sound or the hands grabbing his ankle. The scariest part was the realization that someone or something was living in that abandoned building all along, just waiting for two unsuspecting kids to come in. Even now, years later, he still remembers the icy grip on his ankle and the squeak of unseen footsteps in the dark. Every time he thinks back to that camp, he wonders who or what was inside that bunkhouse with them. And the most unsettling thought of all is that whatever it was might still be there, waiting for the next kid brave or foolish enough to climb inside.